This is Chapter 42 of Pride and Prejudice, or Chapter 19 of Volume 2, and this is actually the last chapter in Volume 2 of Pride and Prejudice. Had Elizabeth's opinion been all drawn from her own family, she could not have formed a very pleasing picture of conjugal felicity or domestic comfort. Conjugal means relating to marriage, so based on her own family experiences, in this case Mr. and Mrs. Bennet's marriage, she could not have imagined that all marriages, or many marriages, would be happy and that the home would be comfortable. Mr. and Mrs. Bennet are very humorous and funny characters, but they really don't have a very happy marriage. Mrs. Bennet does not understand her husband's sense of humor at all. Mr. Bennet enjoys teasing and making fun of Mrs. Bennet, but there's really not that much affection and love between them. Mr. Bennet cares about his daughters, especially Elizabeth and Jane, but there's really not a sense that they're a unified couple, Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, and that they're really not very happy together. Her father, captivated by youth and beauty and that appearance of good humor which youth and beauty generally give, had married a woman whose weak understanding and illiberal mind had very early in their marriage put an end to all real affection for her. Respect, esteem, and confidence had vanished forever, and all his views of domestic happiness were overthrown. But Mr. Bennet was not of a disposition to seek comfort for the disappointment which his own imprudence had brought on in any of those pleasures which too often console the unfortunate for their folly or their vice. He was fond of the country and of books, and from these tastes had arisen his principal enjoyments. To his wife he was very little otherwise indebted than as her ignorance and folly had contributed to his amusement. This is not the sort of happiness which a man would in general wish to owe to his wife, but where other powers of entertainment are wanting, the true philosopher will derive Bennet from such as are given. So we get a little more insight into the Bennet's marriage in this paragraph. So apparently Mrs. Bennet was young and beautiful at one point, and Mr. Bennet fell in love with her. Because of her youth and beauty, she appeared to be good-humored, but that appearance fades over time. And Mr. Bennet really does not love her. He's upset by his poor choice, his imprudence, so he wasn't wise in marrying her. But he doesn't indulge in anything that's really bad to kind of make up for that. He doesn't indulge in anything dangerous or any bad habits. He enjoys being in the countryside, and he enjoys reading books, and he enjoys making fun of his wife. The last one is not such a great coping mechanism, but that's how he copes and deals with his own reality. In Regency England, it was very difficult, almost impossible, to get a divorce. So although the Bennets are not in a happy marriage, they really can't seek to get a divorce. If someone did get divorced at that time, it would often cause a public scandal. People would be really ostracized, not allowed into societal events, would be really looked down upon. The criticism would be incredibly harsh, and it was also something that legally was very difficult to actually get. So that's what our Bennets are doing. Elizabeth, however, had never been blind to the impropriety of her father's behavior as a husband. She had always seen it with pain, but respecting his abilities and grateful for his affectionate treatment of herself, she endeavored to forget what she could not overlook, and to banish from her thoughts the continual breach of conjugal obligation and decorum which, in exposing his wife to the contempt of her own children, was so highly reprehensible. But she had never felt so strongly as now the disadvantages which must attend the children of so unsuitable a marriage, nor ever been so fully aware of the evils arising from so ill-judged a direction of talents which, rightly used, might at least have preserved the respectability of his daughters, even if incapable of enlarging the mind of his wife. So Elizabeth is not blind to the fact that her parents don't have a happy marriage. She's well aware of it, and she's also very well aware that her father is not the greatest husband. He, instead of helping some of his family members, he makes fun of them. She knows that, and she also realizes that and she even calls it reprehensible, something truly horrible, that he exposes and exposing his wife to the contempt of her own children. So by making fun of Mrs. Bennet, he's not making sure that her children respect her either. He's seeing in some ways that her children also make fun of her and don't treat her very seriously. Elizabeth recognizes that this is not a healthy way to function as a married couple. However, she does care about her father so much, and she respects him and admires his mind and his wit, that she has a hard time totally condemning him for this behavior. So it's a sort of situation where she knows that perhaps his behavior and actions are wrong, but she can't hate him because he's still her dad. She still really cares about him in that way. And he does not try to improve his daughters. Instead of trying to correct or enlighten Kitty and Lydia, he just kind of lets them run amok because he thinks it's funny. When Elizabeth had rejoiced over Wickham's departure, she found little other cause for satisfaction in the loss of the regiment. Their parties abroad were less varied than before, and at home she had a mother and sister whose constant repinings at the dullness of everything around them threw a real gloom over their domestic circle. And though Kitty might in time regain her natural degree of sense, since the disturbers of her brain were removed, her other sister, from whose disposition greater evil might be apprehended, was likely to be hardened in all her folly and assurance by a situation of such double danger as a watering place and a camp. So Elizabeth is reflecting on all of this, and she says, okay, the disturbers of Kitty's mind, in other words, the officers in the militia and the men in the militia, are gone. So maybe Kitty will kind of regain her sense. Lydia is kind of stuck because she's still around all of the militia guys, and Lydia probably has the inclination to maybe do more wrong or act even sillier. Kitty's really just a follower. So Lydia's in real danger of just kind of chasing after men her whole life. And she's in double danger because she's in a seaside town. Rules were a little bit relaxed in a seaside town like Brighton, and also being within range of the officers. Upon the whole, therefore, she found what has been sometimes found before, that an event to which she had looked forward with impatient desire did not, in taking place, bring all the satisfaction she had promised herself. It was consequently necessary to name some other period for the commencement of actual felicity, to have some other point on which her wishes and hopes might be fixed, and by again enjoying the pleasure of anticipation, console herself for the present, and prepare for another disappointment. Her tour to the lakes was now the object of her happiest thoughts. It was her best consolation for all the uncomfortable hours which the discontentedness of her mother and Kitty made inevitable, and could she have included Jane in the scheme, every part of it would have been perfect. So everyone is really down in the house now. Mostly Kitty and Mrs. Bennet are very upset that they're not in Brighton and that Lydia kind of gets to have all the fun. So Elizabeth needs something new to look forward to, so she thinks of the tour of the lake region that she's going to go on with her aunt and uncle. But it is fortunate, thought she, that I have something to wish for. Were the whole arrangement complete, my disappointment would be certain. But here, by carrying with me one ceaseless source of regret in my sister's absence, I may reasonably hope to have all my expectations of pleasure realized. A scheme of which every part promises delight can never be successful, and general disappointment is only warded off by the defense of some little peculiar vexation. When Lydia went away, she promised to write very often and very minutely to her mother and Kitty, but her letters were always long expected and always very short. Those to her mother contained little else than that they were just returned from the library, where such and such officers had attended them, and where she had seen such beautiful ornaments as made her quite wild, that she had a new gown or new parasol, which she would have described more fully, but was obliged to leave off in a violent hurry, as Mrs. Forrester called her, and they were going to the camp. And from her correspondence with her sister, there was still less to be learnt, for her letters to Kitty, though rather longer, were much too full of lines under the words to be made public. So everyone's looking forward to Lydia's letters, and she gives very short letters and just talks about, what officers she saw and what things she bought, and then writes, I gotta go, I gotta run with Mrs. Forrester, we gotta go to the camp, and then kind of signs off. Her letters to Kitty are longer, but Kitty won't share them with people. There's a lot of underlining going on in them. Just not something that Kitty is going to publicize. So it's just between Lydia and Kitty, whatever those letters contain. After the first fortnight or 3 weeks of her absence, health, good humor, and cheerfulness began to reappear at Longbourn. Everything wore a happier aspect. The families who had been in town for the winter came back again, and summer finery and summer engagements arose. Mrs. Bennet was restored to her usual querulous serenity, and by the middle of June, Kitty was so much recovered as to be able to enter Meryton without tears. An event of such happy promise as to make Elizabeth hope that by the following Christmas she might be so tolerably reasonable as not to mention an officer above a day, unless, by some cruel and malicious arrangement at the War Office, another regiment should be quartered in Meryton. So Kitty does, as Elizabeth predicted, regain some of her sense and is not quite so officer crazy as she was before. The time fixed for the beginning of their northern tour was now fast approaching, and a fortnight only was wanting of it, when a letter arrived from Mrs. Gardiner, which at once delayed its commencement and curtailed its extent. Mr. Gardiner would be prevented by business from setting out till a fortnight later in July, and must be in London again within a month. And as that left too short a period for them to go so far, and see so much as they had proposed, or at least to see it with the leisure and comfort they had built on, they were obliged to give up the lakes and substitute a more contracted tour, and, according to the present plan, were to go no farther northward than Derbyshire. In that country there was enough to be seen to occupy the chief of their 3 weeks, and to Mrs. Gardiner it had a peculiarly strong attraction. The town where she had formerly passed some years of her life, and where they were now to spend a few days, was probably as great an object of her curiosity as the celebrated beauties of Matlock, Chatsworth, Dovedale, or the Peak. So the plans of the Gardiners change a little bit. They have to delay leaving, and then Mr. Gardiner has to be back in town in London a little bit earlier. So their trip is shortened to only 3 weeks. Still a nice vacation. So they have to change where they're going. They can't go as far as the lake regions, and they have to go to Derbyshire instead. So still not a bad trip, and still will give Elizabeth time to get away from home for a little. Elizabeth was excessively disappointed. She had set her heart on seeing the lakes, and still thought there might have been time enough. But it was her business to be satisfied, and certainly her temper to be happy, and all was soon right again. With the mention of Derbyshire, there were many ideas connected. It was impossible for her to see the world without thinking of Pemberley. It was impossible for her to see the word without thinking of Pemberley and its owner. But surely, said she, I may enter his county with impunity, and rob of it a few petrified spars without his perceiving me. A few petrified spars without his perceiving me. So Derbyshire is where Pemberley, Mr. Darcy's house, is located, but she thinks, I can just go see and tour nature without him even knowing. The period of expectation was now doubled. 4 weeks were to pass away before her uncle and aunt's arrival, but they did pass away, and Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, with their 4 children, did at length appear at Longbourn. The children, 2 girls of 6 and 8 years old, and 2 younger boys, were to be left under the particular care of their cousin Jane, who was the general favorite, and whose steady sense and sweetness of temper exactly adapted her for attending to them in every way, teaching them, playing with them, and loving them. So the Gardiners are leaving their kids at Longbourn, and Jane is going to watch over them because she's so sweet-tempered and enjoys being with her younger cousins. The Gardiners stayed only one night at Longbourn and set off the next morning with Elizabeth in pursuit of novelty and amusement. One enjoyment was certain, that of suitableness as companions, a suitableness which comprehended health and temper to varying conveniences, cheerfulness to enhance every pleasure, and affection and intelligence, which might supply it among themselves if there were disappointments abroad. It is not the object of this work to give a description of Derbyshire, nor of any of the remarkable places through which their route thither lay. Oxford, Blenheim, Warwick, Kenilworth, Birmingham, and Company are sufficiently known. A small part of Derbyshire is all the present concern. To the little town of Lambton, the scene of Mrs. Gardiner's former residence, and where she had lately learned that some acquaintance still remained, they bent their steps, after having seen all the principal wonders of the country. And within 5 miles of Lambton, Elizabeth found, from her aunt, that Pemberley was situated. It was not in their direct road, nor more than a mile or 2 out of it. In talking over their route the evening before, Mrs. Gardiner expressed an inclination to see the place again. Mr. Gardiner declared his willingness, and Elizabeth was applied to for her approbation. So they leave and they head towards Derbyshire, and Pemberley isn't too far off from where they're headed. So Mrs. Gardner thinks, oh, we should go there, and Mr. Gardner says sure, and then they ask Elizabeth for her approbation or her approval. My love, should not you like to see a place of which you have heard so much? Said her aunt. A place, too, with which so many of your acquaintance are connected? Wickham passed all his youth there, you know. Elizabeth was distressed. She felt that she had no business at Pemberley, and was obliged to assume a disinclination for seeing it. She must own that she was tired of great houses. After going over so many, she had really no pleasure in fine carpets or satin curtains. Mrs. Gardner abused her stupidity. If it were merely a fine house, richly furnished, said she, I should not care about it myself, but the grounds are delightful. They have some of the finest woods in the country. Elizabeth said no more, but her mind could not acquiesce. The possibility of meeting Mr. Darcy while viewing the place instantly occurred. It would be dreadful. She blushed at the very idea, and thought it would be better to speak openly to her aunt than to run such a risk. But against this there were objections, and she finally resolved that it could be the last resource if her private inquiries as to the absence of the family were unfavorably answered. So, in Regency England, if you were touring around the country, you could go see these great estates, these grand estates. There's many, if you think of Long Island or many other cities and towns and places, you have a lot of historical houses sometimes. In England, it was the same thing. So you often had estates that were passed down from generation to generation and that had extensive grounds. So Mrs. Gardner says that it's not so much the house at Pemberley that's interesting, but these really extensive grounds, beautiful nature and landscaped areas that you could go and visit. So they're basically going to tour Mr. Darcy's house, which of course makes Elizabeth very on edge, because what if she runs into Mr. Darcy? Nowadays, I think if you were to go on a tour of a historical home or place, it would be kind of the same thing. But we really don't, in modern times, we really don't have too many places where you have a family still living in this house. So it puts Elizabeth in a unique situation. Accordingly, when she retired at night, she asked the chambermaid whether Pemberley were not a very fine place, what was the name of its proprietor, and with no little alarm, whether the family were down for the summer? A most welcome negative followed the last question, and her alarms being now removed, she was at leisure to feel a great deal of curiosity to see the house herself, and when the subject was revived the next morning, and she was again applied to, could readily answer, and with a proper air of indifference, that she had not really any dislike to the scheme. To Pemberley, therefore, they were to go. So Elizabeth asked the chambermaid, what about this Pemberley place? You know who owns it? Of course she knows who owns it. Is the family who owns it down there for the summer? Are they there right now? And the chambermaid says, no, they're not there right now. So that's good news. So once Elizabeth finds out that Darcy is nowhere near Pemberley, the family is not around, she feels more comfortable that she can safely go there and visit it, and she is curious to see what it's like. So she has not really any dislike to the scheme, so she's not going to say no to going to visit Pemberley. And that is chapter 42, and also the last chapter in volume 2.